Sir Charles Hindle-Jones and Bobo, the most intelligent monkey in the world, awakens Cthulhu. Chapter 1. A most peculiar invitation. It began, as most of Sir Charles Hindle-Jones' misadventures did, with a misplaced letter and an excessive amount of brandy. Sir Charles Hindle-Jones, a man of questionable foresight but undeniable style, lounged in his study, twirling his remarkable moustache as he sipped his morning sherry. Across the room, Bobo, the most intelligent monkey in the world, rifled through a pile of unopened letters with the distinct air of a creature who knew full well his human counterpart would ignore anything marked urgent. I say, Bobo, do you ever get the feeling that one's greatness is often called upon at the most inconvenient of times? Sir Charles mused, stretching out his legs. Bobo chittered in response and promptly dropped a wax-sealed envelope into Sir Charles's lap. The seal bore the unmistakable emblem of the Miskatonic Society for the Exploration of the Unknown. Miskatonic, eh? Sounds dreadfully academic. Sir Charles squinted at the text and, with the grace of a man who had never taken an academic matter seriously in his life, tore open the letter and scanned its contents. His eyebrows arched higher with each sentence. My dear Bobo, it seems we have been invited to a most peculiar gathering in the depths of Innsmouth, Massachusetts. Something about an ancient, lost artifact, a ritual, and oh, the fate of mankind hanging in the balance. Bobo's fur bristled. The monkey gave an urgent shake of his head and gestured wildly at the word, Innsmouth. Nonsense! What's the worst that could happen besides? There's bound to be brandy. Sir Charles waved a hand dismissively. Thus, without a moment's hesitation, nor a single thought regarding preparation, Sir Charles and Bobo set forth on their greatest and most catastrophic adventure yet. Chapter 2. The Sinister Shores of Innsmouth. The port town of Innsmouth was, in Sir Charles's esteemed opinion, in dire need of a good decorator. The buildings leaned at odd angles, their wooden facades warped with age and sea spray. The streets were suspiciously empty, save for a few cloaked figures who moved with an unsettling, shuffling gait. Bobo, perched on Sir Charles's shoulder, tugged urgently at his cravat, chittering a warning. Yes, I see your point, old boy. Not exactly a lively holiday spot. Their host, a gaunt man named Dr. Armitage, greeted them at the docks, his spectacles fogged from the damp mist. Sir Hindle-Jones, you must understand. What we seek here is no mere trinket. The Necronomicon speaks of an ancient being, Cthulhu. If this relic falls into the wrong hands... Yes, terribly ominous, I'm sure. But tell me, is there a decent tavern about? Sir Charles interrupted cheerfully. Dr. Armitage rubbed his temples. We are doomed. Bobo rolled his eyes and crossed his tiny arms, clearly foreseeing the inevitable disaster ahead. Chapter 3. A brandy-induced nightmare. The tavern, known as the Drowned Sailor, was as inviting as a haunted mausoleum. The wooden beams sagged under years of neglect, the smell of salt, old beer, and something fishy permeating the air. The locals were a quiet, brooding lot, their bulging eyes and rubbery skin giving Sir Charles the distinct impression that their family trees had fewer branches than was entirely proper. Still, it had brandy, and in Sir Charles's world that forgave many sins. To adventure, Bobo, Sir Charles toasted, sloshing his glass extravagantly. Bobo, though highly skeptical of the establishment, clinked his tiny tankard against his companion's and took a cautious sip. Hours passed in a fog of increasingly enthusiastic drinking. Sir Charles regaled the silent patrons with questionably accurate tales of his past exploits, while Bobo diligently kept an eye on their surroundings, his sharp monkey senses tingling. Well, old boy, I must say, this place isn't quite as dreadful as it looks, Sir Charles declared, rising unsteadily to his feet. Now then, let's return to our lodgings before I decide to invest in local real estate. Bobo, equally unsteady but far more alert, leapt onto Sir Charles's shoulder, chattering urgently as they stepped out into the cold, misty night. As they wandered through the deserted streets, a strange sound drifted from the shore, a low, guttural chanting, mingled with the crashing of waves. Intrigued, Sir Charles motioned for Bobo to remain quiet as they followed the sound. Peering from behind a warped, barnacle-covered barrel, they saw figures emerging from the water, grotesque, amphibious creatures, their slimy bodies glistening in the moonlight. Their wide, lidless eyes gleamed as they shuffled up the beach, muttering in a language that was not meant for human ears. Sir Charles, for once in his life, was struck completely silent. Bobo clutched onto his sleeve, trembling. After a few agonizing moments, the creatures slipped back beneath the waves, disappearing as though they had never been there at all. Sir Charles and Bobo remained frozen for a long moment before Sir Charles finally cleared his throat. "Well, I must say, Bobo, that was something." He tugged at his collar. "Either we've just witnessed something beyond mortal comprehension, or that Brandy was extraordinary." Bobo gave him a firm slap on the side of the head. Right, Sir Charles muttered. "Back to the hotel post-haste." The pair hurried back to their lodgings, their bravado greatly diminished, uncertain whether what they had just seen was real, or the result of far too much brandy. But as Bobo curled up by the window, his keen eyes stayed fixed on the shore, just in case. Chapter 4. The Crypt Beneath Miskatonic. Next morning, still nursing the after-effects of their enthusiastic brandy consumption, Sir Charles and Bobo set off with Dr. Armitage for Miskatonic University. The grand ivy-covered building loomed before them, its stone walls etched with centuries of forgotten knowledge and eldritch secrets. After several hours of searching the library for the fabled tome, Sir Charles, in his typical fashion, managed to accidentally activate a hidden mechanism by leaning against a rather suspiciously placed bookshelf. With a low grinding sound, the floor beneath them shuddered, and a dark passageway revealed itself, leading deep below the university. "I say, secret passages should really be labelled," Sir Charles muttered, dusting off his coat. Bobo, ever curious, scampered ahead, his keen eyes glinting in the dim torchlight. It was he who found the book they had been searching for, resting atop a crumbling altar in the centre of the crypt. But just as Sir Charles reached for it, the muddy ground began to shift. From the shadows, grotesque, fish-like figures began to rise through the damp earth, their unblinking eyes fixed upon the intruders. Bobo let out a warning screech. "Well, Bobo," Sir Charles whispered, hand tightening around his sword. "It appears we have company." Chapter 5. The Price of Escape. Chaos erupted as the fish-like creatures surged forward, their slimy webbed hands reaching for the intruders. Sir Charles instinctively grabbed Bobo and darted towards the passageway, but the creatures were too many too fast. Dr. Armitage, clutching the Necronomicon, turned to them with grim determination. "Go! You must escape with the book." "But my dear fellow," Sir Charles began, but the doctor shoved him towards the exit. Bobo, sensing what was about to happen, let out a panicked screech, clawing at Armitage's coat. The doctor smiled sadly, pried the monkey off, and turned to face the advancing horde. With a final nod, he began chanting words Sir Charles could not comprehend. The crypt shook violently, and a deep rumble filled the air as Sir Charles and Bobo stumbled through the passageway. They looked back just in time to see the tunnel collapse behind them, burying Dr. Armitage and the creatures beneath tons of ancient stone. Bobo let out a mournful cry. Sir Charles swallowed hard, dusting himself off. "Well, that was rather dreadful," he exhaled, gripping the book. "Come, Bobo, we owe the dear doctor a most tremendous drink in the afterlife." And with heavy hearts, they fled into the night. 6. Dreams of the Deep. By the time Sir Charles and Bobo reached their hotel, exhaustion had overtaken them. They bolted the door behind them, placed the forbidden book beneath the bed, and collapsed onto their respective places of rest, Sir Charles sprawling across the mattress, while Bobo curled up on a cushioned chair nearby. Sleep came fast, and with it, nightmares. Sir Charles' nightmare. He found himself aboard a vast galleon, its sails blackened, its timbers glistening as if alive. The sea churned an unnatural green, filled with twisting, writhing things that should not exist. The moon, massive and bloated, hung too low, its surface covered in alien script that hurt to look at. The crew was faceless, robed in garments that flowed like liquid shadow. They turned towards him, their hollow gazes boring into his soul. A chant rose in unison, a deep, guttural incantation that spoke of things ancient and hungry. "Sir Charles Hindle-Jones," a voice slithered from the darkness. A towering shape emerged from the mist. It was not human, nor beast, nor anything that belonged in this world. Tentacles coiled and uncoiled. Massive eyes blinked from every direction. and the very air crackled with the weight of its presence. "You cannot run," it whispered, though no mouth moved. "You cannot hide. The stars turn, the deep calls. You will open the gate." Sir Charles wanted to protest, to huff and bluster, but his voice would not come. His limbs refused to move. The creature reached forward, its shadow engulfing the ship, the crew, the sky itself. He felt his mind tearing, his very soul unraveling. Then he woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. Bobo's nightmare. Bobo, intelligent though he was, had never experienced terror quite like this. He was in a jungle, but not any he had ever known. The trees moved when he wasn't looking, their branches curling like fingers. The ground breathed, pulsing as if alive. The sky had no stars, only a yawning void. From the trees, monstrous figures emerged. They bore the vague shapes of monkeys, yet stretched and elongated, their arms grotesquely long, their faces devoid of eyes. They chattered in inhuman tones, their limbs twitching at unnatural angles. Bobo tried to flee, but the trees closed in. The ground split apart, revealing black water writhing with tentacles. He turned to climb, but a massive hand, webbed, clawed, rose from below, grabbing his tiny form. A voice, deep and endless, rumbled through the void. "You are the clever one, the watcher, the witness, and yet you, too, will kneel." The darkness swallowed him whole. The awakening Bobo screamed and leapt to Sir Charles's chest just as the man bolted upright, his breath ragged. They stared at each other, both wide-eyed, shaken, panting. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sir Charles, voice hoarse, managed, "Well, that was ghastly." Bobo merely shivered and buried his face in his master's coat. Below them, beneath the bed, the Necronomicon's pages fluttered despite the lack of wind. Chapter 7. A debate over brandy. Morning came slowly, dragging a pale mist across the streets of Innsmouth. The previous night's horrors clung to Sir Charles's mind like an unwelcome guest. But rather than dwell on such matters, he did what any reasonable gentleman would do. He poured himself a large brandy. Bobo, still shaken from his own nightmare, sat stiffly on the table, his small hands clasped together, watching Sir Charles with narrowed eyes. "Well, my dear Bobo," Sir Charles said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "it seems we are in possession of quite the mystical tome." He gestured toward the bed where the Necronomicon lay, hidden but undoubtedly present. Bobo let out a sharp chitter, shaking his head vigorously. "Oh, come now, old boy," Sir Charles scoffed, taking a sip. "We can't just ignore the thing. What if it contains vital information? What if it is the key to unraveling this entire affair?" Bobo screeched, waving his arms furiously. Yes, I understand your concerns," Sir Charles said with an exaggerated sigh. "Strange nightmares, incomprehensible creatures rising from the depths, the overwhelming sense of impending doom. It's all rather dramatic, but don't you see? That's precisely why we must read it." Bobo jumped onto the desk, grabbed the brandy bottle and tilted it away from Sir Charles's reach, glaring at him accusingly. Sir Charles raised an eyebrow. Now, Bobo, let's not resort to hostage tactics." Bobo pointed emphatically at the book, then at Sir Charles, shaking his head once more. "You truly think it's too dangerous?" Sir Charles leaned forward, his expression growing uncharacteristically serious. Bobo nodded firmly, clutching the bottle of brandy protectively. Sir Charles sighed, rubbing his temple. "Blast it, Bobo, you're probably right, but still." His gaze drifted toward the edge of the bed. If it was meant never to be read, why does it exist at all? Bobo grumbled, then hopped off the desk and onto Sir Charles's shoulder, giving his ear a light tug as if to say, "No more nonsense." Very well. Sir Charles relented, raising his hands. "For now we shall leave the book where it is. But mark my words, old friend, curiosity is a most persistent adversary." Bobo chattered in response, setting the brandy bottle down just out of reach before hopping onto the window ledge. The monkey's eyes lingered on the town beyond, watching the mist twist in unnatural patterns. Sir Charles exhaled and downed the remainder of his drink. For now, they would wait. But how long could they resist the call of the book? That evening, after more brandy than was strictly necessary, both Sir Charles and Bobo succumbed to a deep drunken slumber. It was Sir Charles who woke first. His head ached, but the room was quiet. Bobo remained curled in his chair, breathing softly. With a grunt, Sir Charles poured himself another drink, then turned his attention to the book beneath the bed. "Well," he muttered, picking it up, A little peek couldn't hurt. He flipped open the ancient tome, its leathery pages rough beneath his fingers. Strange symbols and unfathomable script filled the parchment. And yet, as he stared at them, the words seemed to form in his mind, as though whispering their meanings into his very soul. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Sir Charles began to read aloud. The air grew heavy. The wind outside shifted violently, rattling the windows. A distant thunder rolled across the sky. Sir Charles continued to mutter the incomprehensible words, the syllables crawling over his tongue like living things. Bobo stirred, his ears twitching. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. It had begun. Chapter 9. The Madness of Words. Sir Charles continued reading, his voice growing louder, the arcane words flowing from his tongue like a river of madness. He did not understand the language, nor did he know why his mouth formed the words so easily. Yet still he read, as though compelled by an unseen force. The storm outside raged, winds howling against the windows, the rain hammering like desperate fists upon the glass. The very walls of the room seemed to tremble, the candlelight flickering in unnatural patterns. Bobo's eyes snapped open. The monkey's fur bristled, his instincts screaming that something terribly wrong was happening. He turned to see Sir Charles hunched over the book, his pupils dilated, his hands trembling, as he traced the symbols on the page. With a sharp screech, Bobo leapt across the room, landing squarely on Sir Charles's chest. He grabbed Sir Charles's face with both hands and slapped him. Sir Charles blinked, but his mouth kept moving. Bobo slapped him again, and then, for good measure, one more time. Sir Charles gasped, finally snapping out of the trance. He looked at Bobo, then at the book, then back at Bobo. "Oh dear," he muttered, blinking rapidly. "I do believe I may have made a slight mistake." Bobo crossed his arms and chittered furiously, pointing at the roaring storm outside. Sir Charles swallowed hard, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Right. Well, this is all rather unsettling, isn't it?" He hesitated for only a moment before slamming the book shut. A sudden silence fell. The wind outside died instantly, though the sky remained dark and roiling. The candle flames settled, but an eerie hum still lingered in the air, as though something had heard, and was now listening. Sir Charles stood up so suddenly he almost tripped over his chair. "Bobo," he said, his voice firm, "this book is an absolute menace, and I have come to a singular conclusion." Bobo gave an approving nod before hopping off Sir Charles's chest, landing lightly on the desk. He grabbed the brandy bottle and, with a rather knowing look, poured its contents onto the Necronomicon. Sir Charles grinned. "I've taught you well, old boy." With that, he reached into his pocket, produced a match, and struck it against the desk. The tiny flame flickered in his hand, and for a brief moment Sir Charles hesitated. A distant voice in his mind whispered of power, of knowledge, of unlocking doors that were never meant to be opened. Then Bobo slapped him one last time. Sir Charles shook his head, cleared his throat, and dropped the match onto the book. The fire ignited instantly, the pages curling and blackening as a strange, unearthly shriek echoed through the room, though no lips had spoken it. Sir Charles and Bobo stared at the flames, neither speaking, as the last remnants of the book withered into ash. Outside, in the darkness beyond the storm, something stirred. The 10. The call of the deep. It began with a low, rumbling tremor. The floor beneath them shuddered, the walls groaned, and a glass on the table rattled and fell over, shattering against the floor. Sir Charles and Bobo exchanged uneasy glances. Then another tremor, stronger, more insistent. Bobo clutched onto Sir Charles's sleeve, his fur bristling. The town was shaking. Sir Charles rushed to the window and pulled back the curtains. His breath caught in his throat. Outside, the streets were no longer empty. The people of Innsmouth were pouring out of their homes, their vacant eyes reflecting the lightning that streaked across the sky. They moved in unison, their lips forming silent, rhythmic chants as they shuffled forward toward the sea. One by one they descended from their porches, stepping into the streets, their feet dragging but their purpose clear. Some carried objects wrapped in seaweed, others wore garments soaked through with salt water, though they had not been outside long enough to be wet. Sir Charles felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. "Bobo," he whispered, I do believe we should investigate. Bobo furiously shook his head. Come now, old boy, don't be like that. A little peek won't hurt. Bobo growled in protest, but Sir Charles had already thrown on his coat. With a resigned sigh, the monkey leapt onto his shoulder, clinging tight as they stepped out into the storm. The winds howled, carrying the eerie chant of the townsfolk as they marched toward the shore. The air smelled of brine and decay, and the earth trembled beneath them, as though something far below was stirring. Sir Charles followed at a careful distance, keeping to the shadows, his breath coming short and quick. Bobo clung to his shoulder, his tail twitching in agitation. They reached the edge of town, where the land met the sea. The Innsmouth folk waded into the water, their chants growing louder, their expressions blank, unfeeling. Then the lightning flashed, and for a brief, horrifying moment Sir Charles saw it. A colossal shape beyond the waves, a shadow shifting beneath the surface, its titanic form only partially illuminated. A mass of writhing limbs, of unblinking eyes, of ancient hunger. The very sky seemed to recoil from its presence. Bobo let out a small, strangled whimper. Sir Charles's mouth went dry. Well, he murmured barely above a whisper, that's rather large. The lightning flashed again. The thing moved. Chapter 11. The Edge of Madness. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the monstrous horror beyond comprehension that loomed over the endless depths of the sea. Its form was vast, a shifting mass of tentacles, unblinking eyes, and writhing flesh that seemed to defy all reason. The waves churned violently around it, as if the very ocean rejected its presence. The townsfolk continued their mindless chanting, their arms raised toward the towering entity as though welcoming their eldritch god. Sir Charles staggered, gripping the railing of the dock to steady himself. His mind reeled, the sheer impossibility of what he beheld threatening to consume him. The enormity of the creature, the sheer alien vastness of its existence pressed upon his very soul. His thoughts fragmented, dissolving into 1,000 incoherent pieces as the incomprehensible whispers of the deep slithered into his brain. The stars had turned. The gate was open. Beside him, Bobo clutched his head, his tiny fingers digging into his fur as his whole body shuddered. His sharp little eyes, usually filled with mischief and intelligence, were now wide with unfathomable terror. The weight of something older than time pressed against his fragile mind, threatening to drag him into eternal lunacy. Sir Charles' vision blurred. The very fabric of reality rippled, twisting into something indecipherable. The storm roared, the wind screamed, and the thing beyond the sea watched him. His mind fractured, his breath caught, and then something within him hardened. A single thought cut through the insanity like a blade. Good heavens, man. This simply won't do. Words came from within him, steady, calm, and unmistakably British. A voice that spoke of empire, tea at noon, and an unwavering sense of decorum. A voice that refused to let any monstrosity, no matter how eldritch, reduce a gentleman to gibbering insanity. Sir Charles straightened his spine. His upper lip stiffened. He inhaled deeply, forcing the madness back, replacing it with sheer, stubborn English resilience. With a great effort, he turned his head and slapped Bobo firmly on the back. The monkey snapped upright, blinking rapidly. He looked at Sir Charles, still trembling, his fur standing on end. "Pull yourself together, old boy," Sir Charles commanded, his voice crisp and unyielding. Bobo blinked again. The fog of insanity wavered. Sir Charles adjusted his cuffs, determinedly ignoring the writhing titan in the distance. "I shan't have my trusted companion succumbing to madness. That simply won't do. Now, straighten yourself up, Bobo, and let us." He paused, considering their situation. "Get the absolute devil out of here." Bobo shook himself violently, as if shedding the remnants of eldritch horror. He blinked rapidly, inhaled deeply, then stood tall, or as tall as a small monkey could. He gave a resolute chitter, saluted Sir Charles, and leapt onto his shoulder. Sir Charles nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit." The thing in the water shifted, a deep, resonating groan vibrating through the very marrow of existence. The chanting of the townsfolk rose, growing in intensity as the waters swelled, threatening to consume the shore. Sir Charles adjusted his cravat. "I do believe it's time for our departure." With Bobo clinging to his shoulder, he turned on his heel and ran. Behind them, the sea howled, and something titanic stirred beneath the waves. It was as if the sea itself were being torn apart, the waves rising far too high, their foam unnaturally black. The deep groaning that resonated from beneath the earth set every hair on Sir Charles's body on end. "This is all looking rather ghastly, Bobo," Sir Charles gasped as he narrowly avoided a collapsing lamppost. "I dare say we are in need of an expedited departure." Bobo screeched in agreement, clinging tighter to his shoulder, his tail flicking in panic. They rounded a corner, ducking into an alleyway as cracks split through the cobbled streets, widening with each passing second. The chanting of the townsfolk had reached an eerie crescendo, their vacant expressions unwavering as they marched toward the sea, oblivious to the cataclysm unfolding around them. "Transportation," Sir Charles bellowed, his eyes darting around desperately. "We need..." Bobo pointed ahead. Parked outside a decrepit warehouse was a rusty, battered lorry, its engine still warm, as though someone had abandoned it in haste. Even more fortuitous, a bewildered local stood beside it, his mouth hanging open in absolute disbelief at the nightmarish spectacle unraveling around him. Seasoned opportunist, he strode up to the man, seized him firmly by the collar, and in his most authoritative upper-class tone declared, "I am dreadfully sorry about this, old chap." Then, with Bobo's assistance, he shoved the poor fellow aside, leapt into the driver's seat, and twisted the ignition. The engine grumbled, sputtered, and then, to Sir Charles's infinite relief, roared to life. Bobo scrambled into the passenger seat, slapping the dashboard urgently. "I am well aware of the urgency, my dear fellow," Sir Charles snapped as he yanked the gear stick into place. "Now hold on, this may be a touch precarious." With a grinding jolt, the lorry lurched forward, its wheels skidding against the fractured cobblestone as Sir Charles wrenched the steering wheel, swerving around a group of entranced townsfolk. As they barreled through the streets, dodging falling debris and the oblivious worshippers still trudging toward the sea, Sir Charles let out a breathless chuckle. "This is all going rather well, wouldn't you say?" Bobo shot him a withering glare. Right, Sir Charles muttered. "Let's just focus on not dying." They sped toward the outskirts of town, the distant glow of the airport lights barely visible through the swirling mist and rain. Every instinct told Sir Charles to keep his eyes on the road, to focus on the desperate escape ahead, but something compelled him to look in the rearview mirror. His breath caught. The sea had risen, not in waves, but in something colossal and shifting, a form so massive it dwarfed the very horizon. The lightning illuminated its writhing tentacles, its horrifying eyes, its shape so utterly indescribable that his mind recoiled from the very sight of it. And then, it moved. No guttural sound, something beyond mere hearing. It was felt in the bones, in the very fabric of reality itself. Sir Charles wrenched his gaze away, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Bobo," he said through gritted teeth. "We absolutely must go faster." Bobo, for once, did not argue. The chase was far from over. Chapter 13. A daring flight home. The airport came into view. A desolate collection of dimly lit hangars and lonely runways, a beacon of hope amidst the nightmare. The lorry screeched to a halt, skidding across the gravel as Sir Charles and Bobo leapt out. Sir Charles wasted no time. He straightened his jacket, brushed off the dust, and strode toward the nearest aircraft. A somewhat respectable-looking biplane, its propeller glistening in the dim moonlight. Bobo chittered anxiously, pointing at a sign that very clearly marked the plane as belonging to a private American pilot. "Nonsense, my dear fellow," Sir Charles said, waving a dismissive hand. "I am an esteemed gentleman and an accomplished aeronaut. I once piloted a hot air balloon over Belgium. How different can this be?" Bobo slapped his forehead, with all the confidence of a man who had never flown a modern plane before. Sir Charles climbed into the cockpit, adjusting his scarf dramatically. Bobo hopped into the co-pilot's seat, his tail wrapping tightly around the controls as he let out an exasperated sigh. A shout came from behind them. A group of airport staff had finally noticed the highly improper theft in progress. Sir Charles ignored them completely and began flicking random switches. The engine spluttered, then roared to life. "Jolly good," Sir Charles grinned. "That's half the work done, wouldn't you say?" Bobo frantically pulled levers and adjusted dials, correcting whatever Sir Charles had done to prevent immediate catastrophe. The airport staff were now running toward them, their voices drowned by the thunder of the propeller. "Time to be off," Sir Charles declared, gripping the controls. "Hold on, old boy," This might be a touch unorthodox. The biplane lurched forward, bouncing along the runway as Sir Charles wrestled with the unfamiliar controls. Bobo screeched, grabbing the stick and yanking it back just in time to lift them into the air. The plane wobbled dangerously, veering far too close to a hangar before soaring upward into the night sky. As the ground fell away beneath them, Sir Charles let out a victorious laugh. "See, Bobo? I told you we'd manage. What could possibly go wrong now?" Bobo covered his face with both hands. Below them, the ocean raged, the town of Innsmouth now barely visible amidst the swirling storm. They were heading home, but something deep beneath the waves was still watching. Epilogue: Catastrophe in Boston. Boston Evening Gazette, December 14th, 1921. Unprecedented earthquake devastates Boston. Millions feared dead. Boston Ma. A cataclysmic earthquake struck the city of Boston late last night, leveling buildings, splitting streets, and sending entire sections of the city tumbling into the harbor. The death toll is estimated to be over 3 million, making this the worst natural disaster in recorded history. Eyewitness accounts describe violent tremors, some lasting several minutes, with aftershocks continuing well into the morning. Reports from the coast suggest anomalous tidal activity, with water levels surging and receding in unpredictable patterns before finally settling. Authorities are scrambling to make sense of the disaster, with conflicting theories emerging from leading experts. Dr. Alfred Winthrop, a noted geologist at Miskatonic University, attributes the catastrophe to an undersea fault line rupturing just off the Massachusetts coast. "We may be dealing with a previously unknown geological phenomenon," Dr. Winthrop stated. "The scale of this event suggests something truly extraordinary." Others, however, have put forward more peculiar explanations. Survivors from the affected areas report hallucinations and mass hysteria, with some claiming to have seen shadowy figures rising from the sea. Others speaking of whispers carried on the wind, and more disturbingly, several individuals were found wandering in a trance-like state, chanting in an unknown language. The US government has dismissed these claims as panic-induced hysteria, citing the release of swamp gas from ruptured underground deposits as the probable cause of the strange hallucinations. "This is a tragic but entirely natural disaster," a government spokesperson assured. "There is no reason to believe anything unnatural has occurred." Nonetheless, authorities have placed Innsmouth and the surrounding coastal areas under strict quarantine, with federal forces moving in to investigate reports of unusual seismic activity. Boston Mayor Richard Calloway has urged citizens to remain calm. "Boston will endure," he declared. "We have faced hardships before, and we shall overcome this as well. Our city will rise again." Despite the mayor's assurances, one thing is clear: something immense happened on the East Coast that night. Whether it was a simple natural disaster or something far worse, the full truth meant epilogue 2, a brandy, and some reflection. The fire crackled in the grand fireplace of Hindle Manor, casting flickering golden light over the richly decorated study. Heavy leather-bound books lined the towering bookshelves, and the scent of aged oak and fine tobacco hung in the air. Outside, a soft drizzle pattered against the windows, a stark contrast to the chaos Sir Charles and Bobo had left behind in America. Sir Charles Hindle-Jones sat in his favourite armchair, a fine glass of brandy in hand, his boots propped up on a luxurious ottoman. Bobo, equally at ease, lounged on a velvet cushion beside him, his tiny fingers idly picking at the remains of a biscuit. The newspaper in Sir Charles's lap was folded open to the Boston Evening Gazette's headline. His sharp blue eyes scanned the grim report of earthquakes, devastation, and swamp gas explanations, and he let out a contemplative sigh. He took a sip of his brandy, swirled the glass in his hand, then turned to Bobo with a raised brow. "You don't think that has anything to do with us, do you?" Bobo, without looking up, simply tilted his head to the side and gave him a long, unimpressed stare. Sir Charles cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. "Well, if it did, and I say if, one could argue that we were merely unwitting participants in something far beyond mortal comprehension." Bobo rolled his eyes and took a deliberate sip from his tiny cup of tea. Sir Charles huffed. "Oh, come now, old boy, it's hardly fair to put all the blame on me. Who could have known that reading a few cryptic passages would be such a bother?" Bobo pointed at the newspaper, then at Sir Charles, then mimed a rather dramatic explosion. Sir Charles sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, perhaps a certain amount of caution was warranted." But to be fair, things worked out in the end, did they not? Bobo fixed him with a withering glare. Sir Charles took another sip of brandy and leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. At any rate, I do believe we deserve a bit of a holiday after all that nonsense. He turned to Bobo with a grin. What do you say to a few weeks in the south of France? No cults, no monstrous horrors, just fine wine, sunshine, and perhaps a trifling bit of mischief. Bobo chattered excitedly, giving an enthusiastic nod. Sir Charles raised his glass. To survival, my dear Bobo, and to never ever meddling with forbidden tomes again. Bobo raised his tiny teacup in agreement, though the two of them both knew this was a promise unlikely to be kept. The end